Howdy, folks. I'm Dr. Erica. I am essentially coming here to say hi. How are you? So glad that you're here for the final episode of the year of 2025. This is not the final episode of TwoX Labs. It's not the final episode of the Soft Science. Ultimately, I am just looking for a way to cover all the end of the year bases. Yeah, so this episode you're about to watch is a panel that I did with some other lovely, lovely humans about autism and AuDHD and sex. So the audience for this panel was other professionals, but there is a ton of good information in here. So I wanted to share it with you. And I would love to share the other lovely people with you that are featured in this panel. And so I'm not going to do every introduction of every single one of them because that's in the panel itself. So I just wanted to say hi, hello, enjoy this episode, and I hope you all have a good rest of your 2025. Please take care of yourselves. Please rest while you can. Please get out of the news cycle when you can. And simplify as much as you possibly can for 2026 so that we can continue to deal with all of the things and dumpster fiery type events that may or may not come to place in 2026. I will see you on the other side. You can tell it's time. It's time for the year to end, and it's time for my brain to need a vacation very, very much. I like to say this to all my patients. I'm like, this time of year, the holidays, all of it, from October to the end of the year till after New Year's, is what we call the therapist shit show Olympics. Because everybody wants an emergency session. Everybody wants to talk about preparing to see their families or loved ones or whomever. And everybody wants to debrief afterwards. So us therapists have to spend a lot more time taking care of ourselves. And one of the ways that I am doing that this year is I am not recording any more episodes. I may not even record any more social media for the rest of December because your girl is tired. Anyway, I hope you all take some much needed rest as well. And I will see you in 2026. Howdy, folks. Welcome to our neurodivergence and sex panel. We're so happy to be here with all of you at Autistic Clinical Insights. I am joined by my fellow neurodivergence and sex nerds. We decided it's a band name. Kate Morrow, myself, Dr. Erica Miley, Frank Flosky, and Dr. Cade Sharp. Y'all, we get to jump right in. We're so glad to all of us to be together. I'm going to start our slideshow so that you all can come along with us. This is a topic that is near and dear to all of our hearts. All right. Can everybody see that?
Looking good.
Lovely. All right. Cade, you're going to start us off with objectives.
Yeah, so jumping right in, when you all signed up, maybe you saw our presentation program. We are going to be covering a couple things today. So first of all, you'll leave here being able to summarize the unique sexual experiences and challenges faced by autistic and AuDHD individuals. You'll develop skills to engage in meaningful conversations about sexuality, kink, and intimacy with autistic and AuDHD clients. And you will apply adaptive techniques for sensate focus that cater specifically to the sensory and relational needs of autistic and AuDHD clients fostering an inclusive therapeutic environment.
Woohoo!
And on the flip side, the limitations today, currently there is not a wide variety of research. In fact, a lot of the stuff that's out there is quite outdated and stigmatizing, pathologizing. So what we're trying to do is bring you some of the more recent research. 2016 and on is where you really see a shift in how autistic people are discussed and whether or not we're included in the research about us. So we're going to try to keep it current. There's also some stuff we might share that's a little more anecdotal and just very common in the autistic and ADHD communities. Also, each client and their experiences are going to be unique. So although we might give you some really solid, great suggestions and ideas today, at the end of the day, it comes down to your clinical judgment with that client that's right there with you that you're working with. So take what we say and adapt it. Make it work for your clients. Also, each of us bring pretty unique lived experience perspectives into the space and clinical knowledge. So what we know may not actually match the experiences of your clients or their needs. Again, boils down to clinical judgment. Take what seems useful, you can leave the rest. And then finally, the topic of sex, especially for our neurodivergent clients, it's not really like a one and done, you take one 75-minute course and suddenly you're good to go forever. Please keep receiving ongoing consultation, extra education. But we are excited that you're here with us today.
This is me. I'm Dr. Erica Miley. I'm a clinical sexologist, a certified sex therapist, sex researcher. I have ADHD combined type with a house full of neurodivergent humans. So many of us. I'm super passionate about how neurodivergence and how all of us experience sex and kink. Don't get me started on the lack of research. Kate already started us off with one of the huge limitations. And generally, I love to crochet, paint, quilting, and play video games. Big surprise, there are 25 hobbies on that list.
Hello, my name is Frank Flosky. I'm a licensed clinical professional social worker here in Chicago, Illinois. If anyone out there is from Chicago, woohoo. I am queer. I'm also autistic, ADHD. And areas I work with are, sex therapy and also therapy in general with neurodivergent folks, especially around areas like creativity, motivation. Those are some big areas of interest of mine lately. And then, just non-therapy related. A cat Elijah, who may be jumping on the couch from time to time. I have to be sessions here, so he's like my little assistant. And I enjoy sewing and running. So those are two of my hobbies that help me with self-care.
All right. The two Chicagoans in a row. I am Kate Morrow. I use they, them pronouns. I am queer, trans, non-binary. I am autistic and ADHD and polyamorous. I have a master's in couple and family therapy, so I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. And the work that I do, I'm a relationship and sex therapist, specializing in working with queer, trans, and neurodivergent folks, particularly at the intersections of kink, BDSM, and consensual non-monogamy. And then personally, I am a witchy fiber artist, astrology enthusiast, and forever learning how to be both silly and sacred. And I'm an Aquarius sun, if that piqued your interest when I said astrology enthusiast.
I was like, we need to talk after this, Kate, for
Done.
real.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm Dr. Cade Sharp. I use here, they pronouns. It's always hard to know what to include on these slides. So a few of my identities, I'm disabled, white, autistic, queer, trans. I'm a licensed independent clinical social worker over in Southeastern Washington, not too far from Erica. I've got my PhD in clinical sexology, and my dissertation was actually on autistic kinky empowerment, so specifically how they feel empowered through kinky activities with partners. I'm ASECT and MSTI certified as a sex therapist, also a child mental health specialist and a registered play therapist supervisor. And since everybody's mentioning their cats, I also have 2 senior adopted cats, Ozzy and Molly. Hopefully they won't be making their way out here, though. That's me.
I don't, Frank and Cade and Kate, y'all haven't talked about your cats. I have Cooper. He is a 1-year-old kitten who is asleep right next to me on his little heating pad. So,
Love it.
The cats are present.
So today's agenda, we talked a little about the objectives. First, we're going to start with some myth busting. So what actually is true about autistic and ADHD and AuDHD folks and sexuality? Then we're going to move into intersectionality. How do we understand our clients? Are we being mindful about cultural humility? Then we're jumping into the sexual arousal model. So how does arousal actually work? And then we'll talk about neurodivergent sensate focus. What is it? How do we adapt the activities? Right into myth busting. Whoop, whoop.
All right. Myth busting. Let's get after it.
All right, so getting started, sex is basically the same for autistic and ADHDers as it is for neurotypicals, right?
No way.
Nope. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. Many things about sex can be different for neurodivergent folks, and we'll get into it now.
And yeah, just like Kate was saying, sex is different for neurotypical individuals compared to neurodivergent individuals. But yeah, one thing to remember is various studies show that autistic adults still exhibit healthy sexual functioning and they still want sexual needs, desires. They want to engage with people in a romantic way or a sexual way. When it comes to some of the myths out there, one of them is that autistic people are into deviant sex. Now, when it comes to deviant sex, what really is deviant sex? I know I put that in quotes because there's still a little bit of issues in how to kind of operationally define that. When it comes to some studies out there, things that I've looked at, they've talked about deviant sex in terms of hypersexuality and paraphilic behaviors. When it comes to individuals with ADHD, for example, they have the hypervigilance of being hypersexual, and this is mainly due to impulsivity, due to dopamine seeking behavior, but it is not a symptom or a criteria of ADHD. So even though we hear this from time to time, you have to really look at the nuances of, okay, if somebody who has ADHD, hypersexual, where does that really come from? Or there's another example when it comes to autistic individuals who are hyposexual or aromantic. Studies do say that there's more of a higher prevalence of an autistic individual being asexual, but that once again is not a diagnostic criteria. There's a lot to that. For example, when it comes to the socialization around dating, around sex, around asking for what you want, a lot of those factors make it difficult to engage in sex and dating in a normative way. But to say that, that doesn't mean that autistic individuals do not want sex, do not want to get their needs met. So when it comes to a lot of myths, you have to really look at what is actually going on. And a lot of it, like we said at the beginning, because there's a lack of research. Or there's research that is done on one population that's extrapolated to maybe the whole population based on maybe only research based on one niche. So a thing to take away is that neurodivergent individuals experience the same range of sexual and romantic desire as neurotypicals and deserve support and education.
I think I won't speak for all of you, but when we first all met together, I feel like this was the place where we were all got the most animated because of all of the things that we all hear. Would you say that that's the case? Is this kind of like be your soapbox? Is this what that causes in you when you hear this stuff?
Yeah,
I think
would.
so.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say absolutely. I remember during my dissertation, looking into the old research, and there's something from like the late 80s, early 90s that essentially said therapists should just teach their autistic clients how to masturbate because they will be lucky to even ever do that. And it was kind of brutal. It was like, whoa, that's what they thought of or think of us, Like there's so many ways to express our sexuality, and the researchers really have gotten it wrong for a long time, so that they've just perpetuated those myths.
Yeah, mainly based on how to express the sexual needs. I feel like it's where the research kind of goes off the rail because they're assuming it's based on neurotypical normative, ways of expressing it. Yeah, I feel like a lot of autistic individuals are just myths, kind of, lumped into a group. It's unfair for them.
Absolutely. I think a lot of this is shifting in research. Mostly because we're all sitting here, right? Like we're all talking about this. All of us who are neurodivergent and that are clinicians, but also researchers, we're bringing the attention to that. Hey, researchers, all of you researchers who aren't neurodivergent yourselves, prescribing what you think you see, I think really does and has added gasoline to this idea of the non-sexual autistic or AuDHD person, or that they're hypersexual if they have a higher sexual interest, that just continues to be pervasive, that so many of us are having to fight really, really hard against. Any other reflections? All right.
Research saying that, autistic individuals are more likely to identify as LGBT plus. Once again, correlation doesn't mean causation. A lot of assumptions by that because there's less societal pressure, kind of, sticking to the norm. That's usually one of the underlying factors.
We can chat a little bit more about that. I think one of the other things that we can talk about is, like, I saw recently, I won't call him out directly, but I saw a fairly famous psychologist YouTuber essentially say that if they are screening for somebody who is autistic, that they should be screening them for gender dysphoria. That one goes with the other at such a frequency based on the research that he was talking about, that we should be doing that every time that we're assessing. What do y'all think of that? I just saw the mad face go across everybody's face.
That's so interesting with the research piece there. I would be curious to know what that person knows about what it means to be trans or non-cis, because not all of us have gender dysphoria, first of all.
Yeah.
And then secondly, I would want to know why your client is there. Like, why is this a first step? If, is this related to their goals, or are you just wanting to go there? What use is that? What's going to happen next with that information, regardless of what you find? Because for folks who don't know that are listening in, sometimes that diagnosis of gender dysphoria combined with our diagnosis of being autistic ends up with people gaslighting us or denying services. I think it's something like 30, I'd have to double check. I think it's like 30% of autistic teens who wanted gender affirming care were questioned about that because of their autism diagnosis. So I'd be very cautious with that.
Absolutely. I think that's being kind, Cade. I think that it's, I think it's making serious assumptions about I think your question about what does this person want is the most, every clinician that is listening, you need to ask that question, because I think that goes right into these common myths. What if you are doing the assessing, or if you are doing, if you're working with them around their sexuality, or whatever the case, whatever your role is as the clinician, you really need to center yourself on what does this person in front of you want and need, not what you think they want and need. Frank, did you have any other follow-ups that we missed?
No, I mean, I was going to say, yes, that is true that, when it comes to individuals in therapy, it's very easy for the therapist to kind of, put on an agenda. So yeah, when it comes to that myth that all autistic people are queer, once again, research says there's more of a prevalence, but you have to ask yourself why. A lot of that comes down to just rejecting societal norms, heteronormativity. So yeah, there's more prevalence of polyamory, other types of, queer relationships, asexuality. But at the same time, just because you may know that is in the research, you don't want to assume that. And also ask yourself, like you said, Erica, why is the client coming into therapy?
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. Autistic, AuDHD, and ADHD sexual facts.
Yeah, so we can get into all right, we know the myths, so what's the facts, what's actually out there in the more recent up-to-date research. One of the cool things that we've found over the last 10 to 20-ish years is that autistic people are statistically more likely to be kinky, with the caveat that it also could just be that we're more open about being kinky. So something to consider. But specifically, there are certain kinks that we seem to be more drawn towards compared to non-autistic, non-AuDHD folks. So we're more likely to be into sadism and masochism. We're more likely to be exhibitionists and enjoy things like public play. More likely to enjoy what they call defeat to victory roleplay scenarios. And we're also more likely to be asexual, which we talked about a little bit. And we also tend to masturbate more often than allistic people. We also are more prominent in puppy play communities. And that's an interesting one because the researcher who was doing that study was not looking for autistic folks, but he found autistic folks and then started running like a screener on everyone who was participating and found, oh yeah, these people are predominantly autistic. Yeah.
That's
And then
incredible.
yeah, I was like, what an interesting like secondary finding. You're not going
Okay.
into it to know this, and that's what you end up with. And then the interest-based piece, a lot of us have started explaining autistic and ADHD and co-occurring neurotypes as like interest-based or interest-focused nervous systems. The same might be true of our sex interests. So there was some research that showed that we were more interested in sex when it's interest-driven. So if somehow the sexual activities we're participating in or thinking about or texting about or talking about involve some of our special interests or passions, we're more engaged usually, is what they're finding. Yeah.
Checks out.
I love that. Now I want to see the study on the pup play and the interest based, and I want to see the crossover, and I want to see all of that research. We need more. We need more.
Absolutely.
Sensory sensitivities.
Yes. So when I think about what is different for neurodivergent folks having sex, sensory sensitivities is the main one that comes up for me. So for each sense, autistic folks, neurodivergent folks, I would say anyone in general, can fall on a spectrum anywhere from hypersensitive, so experiencing it to a greater degree, a higher sensitivity, to hyposensitive, so experiencing less of that sense, needing more stimulation. And each person has a unique sensory profile, including neurotypical folks. Everybody has a unique sensory profile. Sensory profile is essentially, your combination of where do you fall on hyper to hyposensitive on any of our senses. And given that each person has a unique sensory profile, I think this presents some pretty unique sensory experiences and accommodations that can come up with sex. I think it can be challenging, and it can be really fun to play with, which we'll talk about a little bit more later as well. One thing I like to think about when I'm thinking about how sensory sensitivities show up in sex is I have the expectation that like partners will have different sensory needs. It's rare, if not impossible, I would say, to have like the identical sensory profile to someone. And I think with neurodivergent folks, autistic folks, our experiences can just vary so widely. And so knowing some of this, knowing some of your sensory profile, your needs, the accommodations, could be good to talk about that up front or early with the partner to kind of so that you're not having to, in the moment, negotiate something that can feel really difficult. So as we move on to the next slide, just something to consider, reflection question. What sensory needs might you have around sex? Something to think of.
Great question.
And I have some examples of perhaps how you might. So this little chart for each sense, I just gave a brief example of how it might show up with hypersensitivity and how it might show up with hyposensitivity. So I will just run through those. So for our sense of touch, an example of hypersensitivity could be that light touch could feel painful or distracting. For instance, hair sensations, fabric, a gentle caress that many people perceive as romantic can be experienced as really physically distressing or painful. Also with hypersensitivity, maybe you might not like certain kinds of touch. So, for instance, like touch with like finger point, kind of pokey is how I refer to it, versus like a flat hand. Stuff like that. And then for hyposensitivity, that could look like someone needing deep pressure, rougher touch, or more intense stimulation. For taste, hypersensitivity could be that one could find bodily fluids or flavored lubes or products gag-inducing or intolerable. which I think can bring up a lot of shame for folks, particularly the bodily fluids part. And so it's good to know that that is just a part of some people's sensory profile. It doesn't have to mean anything. There's not a moral value judgment in that. And then on the other side, someone is hyposensitive to taste. They might not notice strong tastes, and so maybe would be more open to something flavored products, not minding bodily fluids as much. For our sense of smell, hypersensitivity could look like being overwhelmed by scent in general. And I think with sex, there can come a lot of scents. So your partner's breath, their body odor, any perfume, the type of lube that you're using. I think this is another one that can really bring up a lot of shame for folks, particularly the like breath and body odor sensitivity in my experience. And again, just recognizing that like, it's not you're not saying something negative about the other person. It is really just the hypersensitivity can be really intense for some folks. For hyposensitivity for smell, that might look like maybe not registering strong smells in general. And so perhaps being less impacted by your partner's hygiene or the environment that you're in, which can be convenient if that's the case. For sight hypersensitivity, things like bright lights, clutter in the environment, or eye contact might feel too intense. In particular, I think about the phrase intimacy overwhelm with eye contact that can come up in sex, where, I think a lot of the idea culturally of like really romantic sex is like staring at your partner in the eyes and having a really, connected moment. But that can be distressing to some neurodivergent folks, to some autistic folks. And again, I think just with all of this, it's not a value judgment. It's not saying you don't want romance. It's not saying that you don't want to be in that moment with that person, but sometimes it can just feel like a little bit too much. On the other side, for someone hyposensitive with sight, that might look like seeking some extra visual input with sex. So that could look like porn, mirrors, lighting, costumes, filming could also go in there, which again, I think could be fun to play with. For hypersensitivity for hearing, that could look like being distracted or distressed by background noise. So if there's neighbors talking, if the dishwasher is running, if the bed is squeaky in a way that's really freaking you out, all of those things could take you out of sex. For hyposensitivity to hearing, that could look like needing strong sounds like dirty talk, music, moaning to stay engaged in the moment. And then going to proprioception, so that is our body awareness. For hypersensitivity, that could look like feeling really sensitive to feeling off balance, your sense of your body in space. And so that could maybe lead to avoiding certain positions, heads being positioned in a certain way, relative to where other people are at can feel a little bit odd. And then hyposensitivity could look like needing a lot of movement or unusual positions to feel embodied and really in the experience. And then lastly, with interoception, which is our internal signals, hypersensitivity could look like being over-attuned to heartbeat, breath, arousal, all of which can feel really overwhelming, can really take us out of the moment. And hyposensitivity for interoception might look like difficulty noticing arousal or orgasm buildup, which can be, difficult for the person. And so folks that experience that could benefit from external cues, perhaps. So these are just one example for each, but I hope it has sparked your mind to kind of be thinking about how this might show up for clients, and hopefully you're thinking about how it shows up for you, and something good to think about.
We're going to talk about it more here in a minute, but all of these that you were listing, Kate, I was like, wow. No wonder we're going to be talking about kink and how people can predict things. For those of us who are neurodivergent, trying to navigate all of our sensations.
Yeah, so we've touched on it a little bit already, but for folks who aren't familiar, queer people are twice as likely to be autistic as heterosexual folks. Trans people are anywhere from 3 to 6, and I think one study was even as high as 9 times as likely as cisgender people to be autistic. And then we don't have great stats on folks who are racialized because there has not been good assessment methods, good ways of self-identifying that are believed by providers, a huge lack of research around those communities. So our Black, brown, and other racialized people, we don't know exactly how prevalent it is to be autistic. We have some guesses, but really depends on the research and what country they're in and what the views of autism are there. But as you're
Yeah.
working with clients who are part of some of these communities and groups or hold these identities, it's really important to know that you might be working with someone who's autistic, ADHD, AuDHD, and kind of keeping that in the back of your mind. You don't have to like assess every single person for it. You know, it's not that vital to know it right up front. But as you learn about them and you learn their stories, and if you start to notice some of that, the common narratives that we share could be useful to go there with them, especially if they're coming to you for anything relating to sex. You know, if you're hearing a lot of sensory stuff, if you're hearing sex just isn't interesting, if you're hearing the eye contact is hard, or communicating about it, or the lead up to it is tough, like looking at that through a lens of, oh, might this be someone who's autistic or AuDHD or ADHD or some other form of neurodivergence? Anyone have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think just kind of chiming in on, experiences working with clients that might have some of these intersecting identities, and that are autistic, ADHD, neurodivergent. For working with queer and trans folks, I find that being able to have or to help clients facilitate conversation around areas that they're not comfortable with, touch and play in particular, can be a really another great thing to be able to talk about ahead of time. And I think with sex therapy specifically, another thing that I see come up pretty often is navigating body dysmorphia with trans folks. So maybe particular types of touch, areas, like I mentioned earlier, and addition to like words for body parts or activities. Some people can have really strong like body reactions or feelings about the typical language that we use. And so, knowing if your partner wants you to call it their clit or their cock will make a big difference for the experience of the moment.
Yeah.
And then, oh, sorry, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say that's a great point. And, as we talk culturally too, like if we know that these intersections happen quite often, get culturally competent, know how to bring up topics like what you're talking about, that can be a tough one to bring up even in session. So learning the ways to talk about those things. If you have someone whose family is from Mexico and they are all Catholic, you might approach sex therapy or topics, discussing sex a lot differently based on the religious aspect or that they're from Mexico. How would we adapt our style to suit those needs too? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And another part of, intersectionality that I like to think about with neurodivergent folks in particular is disability as well. Because I feel like that is another thing that can often be intersecting with the identities that we've been talking about so far. And I think in working with disabled folks in sex therapy, I think in general, but in particular, I try to have a pretty broad focus on like clear communication and again, conversation ahead of time about, what accommodations might someone need, what positions or activities might not be accessible, what might a person need in a moment that might not be standard, perhaps. And I think, sometimes I think I have heard that sometimes talking about accommodations needed for sex is like not very sexy or can kind of like turn you off or the other person off is sometimes a fear. But I think that attention to accommodations needed for sex is very sexy because, when you're having these kinds of conversations, especially ahead of time, you're setting yourself up and your clients up, hopefully, for way better sex, which I love.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, it's vulnerable to have those conversations, which can be sexy in its own right too,
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
knowing and being that attuned to yourself and knowing your needs and getting to know your partner's needs that deeply. It's so interesting that a large part of society would say it's not sexy when so many of the foundations there are what we generally consider sexy or attractive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here we go. Kink and BDSM.
Yeah, my fave. So, as we mentioned earlier, autistic, ADHD, neurodivergent folks are more likely to be kinky or to identify as kinky openly, perhaps. And there's some ways that I see neurodivergence showing up and kind of intersecting with kink and BDSM in particular. First one, of course, being sensory seeking. I think with kink and BDSM, there's such a lovely opportunity to use sensory profiles for play. There's so many different possibilities depending on each individual person's hyper sensitivities and interests that can be really, engaging and fun to play around with. So for instance, bondage, impact play, temperature play, there's so many possibilities when we use our sensory profiles. In addition to then, of course, accommodating the parts where we do struggle. I think another piece that I see is that kink and BDSM can be really great for clear and direct communication, which we could call scripting, perhaps. For autistic folks, scripting ahead of an experience is often really helpful for mentally preparing, just kind of getting yourself in the headspace for something. So why not sex? I think that scripting, negotiating a scene perhaps could allow for more of a felt sense of control and understanding going into or experiencing a sexual experience. In addition, the process of negotiating a scene or just play in general can really help folks better understand their needs and actually request accommodations. Like I mentioned earlier, rather than like in the moment, which can be more difficult, especially to kind of make those asks that might feel a little vulnerable or scary. And lots of folks find having time to mentally prepare for sex very helpful. Knowing that that is like on the table or the plan can kind of help you get into a good headspace rather than, we have a hard time with transitions. The hard transition from regular life to, and now we're having sex just sometimes does not work. I would say often does not work. So we love a good scripting moment. And then going along with that, I think I see a lot of benefit to having really clear expectations. I think, kink and BDSM play relies a lot less on assumptions and social norms, and that can be really beneficial, especially for folks who perhaps struggle with understanding, what are the like normative assumptions that go into we are having a sexual experience and what does that mean? In addition, I think power exchange dynamics can provide clear roles for sex, whether that's like broadly in general or for a particular like scene or play. And we love a clear role. We love knowing the rules, so to speak. And then also I think safe words are great, just in general. I really like the stoplight system. So green for good, more, yellow for, whoa, hold on a minute, maybe not, and red for hard stop. We need to be done in this moment. I also find a lot of benefit in like a predetermined hand or nonverbal signal for if speaking becomes inaccessible during sex. So for instance, like a certain type of tap, or I think just an easy like can be great, especially for general anxiety around communication and sex. I think sometimes it can be hard to just like say the thing that we're really feeling or the thing that we're really wanting in that moment. And for the record, we can utilize all of these strategies outside of kink as well. I think they just broadly apply.
I think those are great points. And especially with that like safe word piece or the stoplight system, it provides a lot of safety when you go into those environments and you already know what your partner or partners expect of you and how they're going to tell you if you're out of bounds or it's not working for them anymore, or they're no longer interested. You don't have to worry so much that later they're going to go, well, you didn't read, you couldn't tell my expression was saying stop, or that I didn't really like that, or when I sighed, that meant to end it. It's very clear. So I think there's some benefit to us even introducing kink to clients that may not be there yet, introducing it gently and at their own pace, but letting them know there's more out there.
They will everybody who's involved is so much less likely to be blindsided by something. Not only just an event, but like what you were saying, Cade and Kate, like the idea that, oh, that I didn't get the facial expression right, or maybe I even lost my ability to, I'm overwhelmed by this experience, or overwhelmed in positive ways around this experience. So I've lost maybe some ability to speak. So being able to predict or understand what's going to happen next and just provides a lot of safety for everyone involved.
Absolutely.
I just want everybody to be kinky. That's all. That's just sexual trauma.
Yes. So pivot here. Bit of a less fun topic that I think is unfortunately really important when we're thinking about the intersection of neurodivergent folks and sex. So the statistic up at the top, around 70% of autistic adults of any gender report experiencing some form of sexual assault or interpersonal trauma, which is high. And there's a lot more data on autistic women. We can have feelings about that. Stats there are between 60 to 90% of adult autistic women specifically report experiencing sexual assault or interpersonal trauma, which is hard. As I was looking up stats, that was hard for me to read, to be honest. And I think it's just something that we don't talk about very often. And unfortunately, I'm of the opinion that we should assume sexual trauma as the norm for neurodivergent folks and not the exception. You know, seeing these stats, it is more rare to not have experienced a type of sexual trauma or interpersonal trauma. So I think it should just be something as clinicians that we keep in the back of our mind. Because it also might be something more difficult for clients to talk about. And even without knowing specifics about, you know, any particular incident of abuse or trauma, I think just kind of having a general awareness of how someone having experienced a trauma related to sex might show up can be really helpful for us. So a couple that I think about specifically are, first of all, masking in sex. So I see this super frequently, super common, especially I think when folks are used to dissociating from their body in their day-to-day, which again, I think unfortunately can be kind of more of the norm than the exception, because I think culturally we are very socialized and conditioned to just like shove away, dissociate, body distress, especially sensory sensitivities and how that might show up. And so, you know, when we're in the habit, not by choice, obviously, but when we're in the habit of dissociating from our body in our day to day, I think it makes sense that then it would be difficult, or it would be a similar energy when it comes to sex as well. Sex can be really easily activating. I think it holds a lot of meaning in a lot of different ways for folks. And so, you know, when we might be activated in a sexual experience, that could make it more difficult to speak up, particularly if we go into freeze or fawn. One way that this might show up could look like pretending that your sensory sensitivities aren't real, aren't happening, aren't impacting your experience. This is a really big one that I hear with clients, particularly the like hypersensitivity to smell. I hear often that folks really try to like not be bothered by their partner's body odor or by their breath because they don't want to care. They don't want it to matter to them. But at the end of the day, it's still a thing impacting their experience. And, you know, like I said earlier, I think being able to walk through with clients that our sensitivities, our needs, you know, the way that things show up in sex are not personal. Like it really doesn't have to be, we place a moral value judgment on that, but that it is just, it is what it is. It's a part of our experience. I think another way that masking can look could be pretending to not be bothered by boundary pushes or consent violations. Again, unfortunately, with experiences being activating and with masking kind of being a person's norm, it can be really easy, especially again, if we're in that like freeze or fawn state, to just shove it down and not say anything about it and just try to pretend like everything's cool and we actually don't care. And then later processing and having a lot of feelings about it. And I think that in and of itself, we could consider a moment of sexual trauma, of having to, deny your own needs or experiences in that moment. So I think in working with clients and masking, we want to help clients make unmasking during sex to their comfort level, because again, in general, we don't want to expect that everyone wants to be 100% unmasked all the time. But to their comfort level, we want to help them make unmasking as easy as possible. So, again, relating to the previous slide around like the benefits of having discussions before sex for clear communication and expectations. If we have like a solid idea of the experience we're going into, if we have a solid idea of our likes and dislikes, our sensory profile, as well as that of our partner, and we have a solid system for how do we navigate in the moment if something is happening that one of us isn't super into, I think that can really help decrease the masking that comes up during sex. And then
I think it's just beautifully put what you're saying, Kate. Seriously, I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm kind of curious. I notice when I'm working with people around masking and they start to understand where masking is throughout their life, I have found that many of my folks, that's when they start to understand maybe they were experiencing a sexual assault.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And with that, I find it helpful to discuss consent specifics with all clients in general.
Yeah.
So in this moment, we're talking about neurodivergence, but I think culturally we can kind of assume that we're on the same page around what consent means and how that shows up in sex. And I think in practice, that is often not the case. And so in discussing consent specifics with clients, we want to help promote a sense of sexual empowerment and autonomy in our clients. Something that I like to say to my clients a lot is, you're in charge. You're the boss of your own body during sex. And
Absolutely.
often it cannot feel that way. So I think helping clients kind of build up that sense of sexual autonomy can be really helpful. Specifics, I like to explain that anything other, or to kind of have we try not to assume in general, but I think a helpful assumption can be that anything other than a hell yes is a no. I think this is another area where everybody, but I think probably autistic folks in particular, could struggle with understanding the nuances of what someone else might be saying. Is a maybe later actually a maybe later, or is that person not feeling able to say a hard no in that moment, putting the expectation on ourselves that we need to be able to like accurately decipher that in the moment, I think is just unrealistic and can lead to a lot of distress on both sides. I also talk to clients about how substances impact our experience of consent. And I also want to draw attention to how being inebriated might make it harder to speak up in the moment, going back to masking during sex. And I also like to explain coercion to my clients, that if you say no and you get a response of someone trying to make you feel bad, or, oh, are you sure? I really wanted to. It would really mean a lot to me, anything like that. It's coercion. And I think I have found that folks don't often think about it in that way.
Absolutely.
Any thoughts on consent before I go on?
I mean, everything you've said is super accurate, and I think attendees, you're going to notice that like this weaves into everything that we're talking about today.
Yeah, absolutely. So last piece of working with sexual trauma in sex therapy with neurodivergent folks that comes up for me often is understanding triggers. So helping clients being able to, first of all, notice, and second of all, track what experiences activate them. Could be related to past trauma, sensory sensitivities, masking, consent, whatever. I think often just literally like recognizing that it is happening is the first step. After the fact, first of all, and then in the moment, I feel like is a different step to be able to recognize when you're activated, or perhaps experiencing a trigger. And so I really like to normalize with clients taking and asking for a break or a breather during sex. I think that can be something that can feel awkward for folks to ask for or to implement. But I think, again, in general, for all people, not just neurodivergent people, I think that's a skill that is really helpful to build in a relationship and in your, personal comfort with that. And that any slowing down or pausing doesn't have to mean, and now we're done and you ruined it and the moment's over forever, but that you can give yourself a second, say, I need to take a breather, give yourself a chance to feel the feelings that are coming up in that moment, to acknowledge them, to take a second to breathe, come back into your body, and then make the decision to re-engage if you want. Can be really useful. I think sometimes when we think about how triggers might show up with sex, there can kind of be the assumption that like, well, if you recognize that you're triggered in sex, then that just needs to be like a hard stop and then you're done, which can feel really threatening to folks, or scary. And so also normalizing that like you can have an experience of being triggered and then still want to go on, and that is also okay, that it's really, about that like personal autonomy. And just reminding clients in general that they're allowed to ask to slow down, to shift gears, to stop a particular activity, or to stop altogether. Is another one that can feel difficult, going back to masking again. And then with triggers, I think another last place that I see this show up a lot is deconstructing learned narratives with clients around shame and sex and how that might activate or trigger us in a moment. I think particularly around like religious or cultural scripts and expectations is something that I hear come up for clients pretty frequently. And so just being able to help clients kind of understand what is going on for them in those moments where sex is not as fun and hot and easy and effortless, but that can be a part of the experience and it's okay.
Absolutely. On to ethics.
Yeah, I know the theme this year is diving deeper, so we don't have to go a ton into ethics. I'm sure most people are pretty familiar, but I just wanted to point out 4 main ones that I always consider when I'm doing sex therapy and things relating to sex, like discussing it, working on skills, whatever they need to do. The first one is keeping in mind a client's right to self-determination. So client autonomy goes right back to the consent piece, really, making sure that your client is kind of in the lead here, gets to decide what does or does not get discussed. You're of course able to ask questions, but if they're not wanting to go to a certain topic ever or yet, we've got to respect that. If their goals are things that we wouldn't necessarily want for ourselves, we still have to respect that. And then on the flip side, if our goals for that client do not match what they want, we should respect what they actually want. If you have a client who comes in and says that they're an autistic 22-year-old and they haven't had sex yet, we don't just jump in and go, oh, we should sign you up for a dating app. Like, let's plan around how to get you a partner so that you can have sex. If that's not what they're there for, that's okay. We want to go with their goals. Maybe they're coming to you because they want to work on like getting into a certain college. The second piece is cultural humility. We already talked a little bit about intersecting identities and how important that is, but my key takeaway here for cultural humility is to really prioritize learning from lived experience and your client's lived experience. So even if they're describing something that you're like, I didn't know that was physically or mentally possible, believe your client first and foremost, and go out and get some consultation or research, others who have had similar experiences. See what that's like for them so that you're better prepared to support them. The third piece is clinician skill set. So first of all, how are you approaching the conversations you're having? Or if you're more of a play-based or somatic-focused therapist, how are you deciding what you do with that client? Who might you need to bring into the fray with certain clients? Sometimes when we're working on sex-based things, there are a or many partners that may need to come into the therapy room to know how to better support that client, where our role shifts from maybe educator to more of like a mediator. It really depends. And it depends on your role and your therapeutic philosophy as to how many people you involve, who you involve, when you involve them, which leads to that final piece for the skill set. The when is not just when we build skills, it's also like when we do or when we utilize our skill set. When are we maybe providing education? When are we just allowing space to process? When are we bringing up a different modality or technique that we could try with the client? When are we approaching certain topics and just really paying attention to that client and what they say their needs are? And then finally, referrals. Another when question. When might you need to refer out? Because we can't be everything for everyone and we can't have unlimited skills. So kind of assessing for yourself, where are some places that maybe you hold some bias that you need to work on? So if you had a client who came in and a few months in, maybe you find out that they have an OnlyFans career that you didn't know about. Is that going to be a deal breaker for you to still hold them in unconditional positive regard? Or maybe they come in and they're struggling with POCD, like pedophilic OCD. Is that something that you're comfortable with working with, you have skills around, or would that be a time to refer out? And then finally, who will you refer people to? So I like to have a little list of go-to, here's where I might need to refer someone out. Who would I send them to? So I've got that list already, because often when we suggest referring a client out or terminating, it can feel like we're judging, like it's a value judgment on the client, but it's not, And so when we already have that prepared, I think it just makes things go smoother and it takes a lot of that guilt or stigma out of it. That's it for this one.
Absolutely. I mean, big surprise, all of us are giant nerds. That's why we got this band together. So we're actually we want to make sure that we prioritize your time for questions. So we're going to move on to a couple of their slides, and you can ask us about the slides we didn't get to talk about today, but just some of mine and of course Kate too. But we're going to talk sensate focus. Come on, Frank.
Oh, sensate focus. Yeah, when it comes to sensate focus, it is a technique in sex therapy originated by Masters and Johnson, basically designed to reduce performance anxiety and help people connect with physical intimacy in a non-goal way. When we think of sex, especially heteronormative sex, we think of getting to penetration, or the trope of, first base, second base, getting to the bases. So this kind of takes all that out of the mix. There's no goal at all. It's just about curiosity and exploring, and it's breaking down into some steps. Non-genital touching, these are the first step, just, to get the client, acclimated. Then it may include some chest, some genital touching with the breast, but not to the point of wanting to become aroused. Once again, it's just curiosity, exploring your partner's body, and also this could be applied to doing it on your own. So just exploring your own body. And then, there's a third step some people include, which incorporates lotion. And then that could just be another extra sensory thing. And there's a nice Cornell Health article here, kind of, talks more about sensate focus and how you can apply that. But when it comes to applying that to specifically neurodivergent folks, there's a little bit of extra steps that you want to be aware of. This is a term that we've talked about a lot today, sensory differences or sensory sensitivities. That also leads into something that Kate was talking about, which are sensory profiles. It's about getting an idea of what your partner's sensory profile is, what senses they like, smell, taste, and senses that they don't like, that would be adverse for them in a sexual setting. And a technique is body mapping, is just literally going through the body. It's your body, your partner's body, to kind of get a check-in to see, okay, what does this zone do for you? What does this zone do for you? You can gradually go down the whole body to collect a lot of valuable information. And then that leads into what we were talking about with the spectrum slide, if you can recall, the hyper versus hypo sensitivities. That's another piece of information you want to get into account when it comes to examining your partner's sensory profile or your own sensory profile. And then there's another piece when it comes to environment and setting. You want to be extra aware, going to senses of the environment, of what would work best for whether it's the neurodivergent partner or in general what will work for you. So for example, heated blankets, that could be a beneficial extra thing to include. Having that weight could be beneficial, and just firm pressure. What does that pressure look like? Are you on a bed? Are you on the floor? Are you on a massage table? A lot of times when people think of pressure, they think of the person who's touching. But you also want to take consideration, the pressure that you're just naturally having, so the surface you're lying on. And then there's the area of communication. Sensate focus just in general promotes open communication by taking the expectation of penetration off the table. So you just want to be a little bit extra with that. By extra, what I mean is try to not mask. I know Kate kind of talked about that when it comes to masking as a piece of sexual trauma. Sensate focus really is a way to practice not masking. And another piece of that is asking your partner what grounding techniques work for them, what benefits them when they are deregulated. Because also this is a practice in managing your partner's deregulation and how can you help co-regulate that partner. Another piece to take with this whole thing is just to slow down, avoid rushing. Once again, Sensate focus employs that, but I feel like you need to, once again, be a little bit extra with that when working with neurodivergent individuals, whether it's a mixed neurotype partner or they're just both neurodivergent themselves. And then all these can be applied to doing it with yourself or with a partner. I believe Sensate focus was originally constructed to be a partner-based activity, but I think this could be a great opportunity to explore your own body if you don't have a partner. Also, a word that Kate brought up was interoception. If you're doing this on your own, it could be another technique in a way just to learn more about your body and what it wants. So yeah, just some takeaways. If you're the practitioner working with individuals wanting to practice sensate focus is open communication, really be mindful of sensory differences, and don't rush. Slow down, and don't have them push through the discomfort just for the sake of the activity.
Absolutely. Additional resources.
Yeah, so we've got kind of a selection of books here. ADHD After Dark is maybe one of the first kind of modern books that talks about sex for ADHDers, so important to read that or at least know how to reference it if you're working with a lot of ADHDers. And then this book is kind of a collection of a bunch of different authors, but exploring autistic sexualities, relationality, and genders. It covers a wide variety of topics, really does hit on the intersections regarding gender and transness, queerness, so I would recommend that. That book is a little more clinical, not so much for clients, unlike ADHD After Dark, which is a pretty casual book, great for clients. Then we also have Gender Identity, Sexuality, and Autism, another one that really hits on those intersections again, and I don't know about the rest of you. I would say it's probably more of a clinical book as well. And then finally, this book is not out yet. I believe it's like a pre-order or like get on the waiting list to hear about when it's released. But I had the pleasure of being on Dr. Dolly, I think she's going by Dolly Marie on her website, on her dissertation committee, and what her project was this book. It's called Bonded, An Autistic's Guide to the Healing Powers of Kink. So this is mostly for clients to use as like a self-guided, what kinks do I want to explore for myself? If I have a partner or multiple partners, how would I discuss this and explore this with them? If I want to go to what's known as like a munch or a dungeon, like actually get involved in the kink community, how might I do that? A lot of really good scripting in there, some kind of checklist type things, considerations. So I think if you go to the website there, you will get a chance to sign up for like the email list so you can hear about when it gets released. And then I've got the, under tools, I've got a sensation to kink flow chart that I created in conjunction with Sabrina Longley, who's another therapist, also kinky and autistic, I believe AuDHD. So we really went through and kind of like what Kate had in relation to sex about like hyper and hyposensitivities. We created one that it touches on all of the sensory systems and gives ideas for folks who are hyposexual and hyposensitive and hypersensitive as far as what to explore. And some of the kinks listed, we didn't say this here, but hopefully folks know not every kink is sexual in nature. So some of the kinks listed don't have to be used in a sexual way. And then some of the kinks are definitely more sexual in nature. So it's like got a good mix for people to have some prompting to explore some new things. And then finally on this list of resources, we've got Thrive, which is a virtual BDSM and mental health conference. The neat thing about Thrive is it's usually pretty low fee. It has both a professional track and a track for like everyone who just wants to attend and learn some cool things. The presenters all have lived experience as kinky folks who are neurodivergent. And so you get to meet a lot of people, hear a lot of stories from many different like walks of life and experiences. And yeah, a very welcoming community. So I would recommend folks check that out, if not for them, for their clients.
Okay.
Um,
Let's see. Hold on. We're supposed to have other things.
Yeah, just two more. Yeah, this is just a brief view of like one of the freebie pages from the flowchart. So this has a little selection of a bunch of different ideas and sensory sensations. So if you're someone who really likes exerting pressure, then you'd pull up this and you'd check out like what are some kinky options? Maybe you should try out pedal pumping. Maybe you should do some crushing role play. Maybe you're into spanking, like giving the spanks. So you can see every sensory system is touched on. Here, this is just a selection of a few, but if you want to go in and get your copy, the clinical use version, we're discounting it by 10% for ACI folks in November. So the code is ACI10. And that's it for this slide.
All right. So just to close us up, just want to end us on a note of play. I think in general with sex therapy, I like to center around play and just having fun with the experience, with some struggles sometimes around maybe communication differences or having a hard time knowing what you like. I really try to help encourage clients to foster an attitude of just like curiosity and exploration. We don't have to completely know everything that we like and for sure don't like. And it's just kind of releasing some of that like pressure expectation and encouraging our clients and ourselves, I would say, to play a little bit. And that's it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, folks, for sticking around with us all the way through. If you would like to see more from any one of us, Kate, Erica, Frank, Cade, there's lots of ways to get in touch with us. We'll make sure that they have contact information for all of us. So if you have any questions, now's the time. And thank you from all of us in this neuro sex. We need a good band name. Neurodiverse sex band. I don't know. Like it just needs to be like a rad band name. But either way, y'all hit us up with any questions you got.